We knew things had gotten bad for Russia. Economically, Putin has spent over 4 years crippling his country's economy with a forced shift toward military industrialism that has sacrificed everything except for oil, gas, and weapons production. But we didn't know it was so bad in Russia that the Soviet economic collapse was starting to look like a picnic. Right now, something is happening in Russia that we haven't seen in 30 years. And what is the Kremlin's and the central bank's response? Cannibalize Russian money to the point where the average person will lose an arm and a leg to Putin's war. Russia's forces are faltering on the battlefield, but the real damage is being done inside Russia as everyday people show Putin that the trust is gone. To understand what we mean, you need to take a little dive into how Russian consumers are treating their money right now. It's not good from the Kremlin's perspective. In a June 8th report, Euromaidan Press revealed that Russians withdrew about $5.2 billion in straight cash from their bank accounts in May 2026. That's billions pulled out of Russia's banking system and into people's pockets. And that number matters because it's the largest single-month cash outflow seen in Russia since the country's central bank started keeping records in 1995. What we've just seen is a 30-year record for cash withdrawals in May, and this isn't a one-off. It's the culmination of a pattern that we've been seeing in Russia for months. In its own June 8th report, United 24 Media reveals that $14.8 billion worth of Russian banknotes have been added to circulation since January, which breaks down to an average of $2.96 billion being withdrawn from Russian banks every month in 2026. And crazily, May isn't even the worst month of the year for Russia. May 2026 just holds the 30-year record for all Mays since record began. In April, Russians pulled a staggering $9.2 billion out of their bank accounts. March wasn't too far behind May either, as $4.1 billion left the Russian banking system and entered Russian pockets. What we're seeing here is a cash flight the likes of which hasn't been seen since the early months of the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's an indicator of something that Putin never wanted to see. Everyday Russians have completely lost faith in their banking system. And frankly, it's hard to blame Russia's people for what they're doing right now. On the most basic level, there isn't much about Russian banking that makes the idea of keeping money in savings accounts all that appealing. Despite Russia's base interest rate being a sky-high 14.5%, the rates offered on savings accounts by banks are low enough to make keeping money in an account almost pointless. Households are choosing to hold money in cash because that cash isn't doing much for them when it's put into a bank account. But there's more to it than that. Behind the interest rate problem lies an escalating situation that affects all of Russia's banking sector. On May 17th, the Kyiv Post published an interesting article that revealed that Russia's banking system is in dire straits. Citing data from the pro-Kremlin Center for Macroeconomic Analysis and Short-Term Forecasting, or CMACP, the outlet revealed that toxic and non-performing assets across Russia's entire banking sector have exceeded 10%. That matters because breaching this threshold for 3 consecutive months is enough for the International Monetary Fund to declare a systemic banking crisis in a country. Russian state banks are trying to hide this growing problem. These ruinous assets and the defaults they bring with them are being masked by artificial loan restructuring programs designed to make it look as though banks are in stronger financial positions than they really are. Non-performing corporate loans are chosen for this masking, which up until this point has prevented the types of bank runs that could cripple entire financial institutions. But those runs are coming. The numbers say it all. And it's not just the sheer scale of cash withdrawals that has Russia's central bank panicking. CMACP says that corporate liquidity is drying up to the point where almost half of all registered Russian enterprises are citing severe payment delays from their corporate partners, which in turn makes it harder for them to make repayments on their loans. There's a house of cards in place here, and a tornado is heading right for it. What we're seeing here is the beginning of what looks like a multi-month bank run. Billions being withdrawn from banks is bad. If those withdrawals become focused on individual banks at that volume, we will start to see entire financial institutions collapse inside Russia. Average Russians and even business owners are scared, and they should be. Beyond the state of Russian banking, people are fearful of losing their savings, partially due to the potential bank collapses, but also due to the Kremlin granting itself increased control over Russia's financial operations. Even the internet is playing a role. As Putin demands more internet outages, supposedly to help Russia deal with the threat of Ukrainian drones, but really to minimize the amount of evidence that gets shared on social media of Ukraine's success, millions of Russians often find themselves spending hours and sometimes days without access to their bank accounts. However, the story runs even deeper than that. Russia is preparing to cannibalize one of the most sacred financial instruments in Russia to continue funding the war. Russians don't want to be caught off guard by the sneaky trick that the Kremlin has in store, but we won't get to that just yet. On top of Russians wanting to have more cash to hand to deal with the here and now expenses that they might not be able to handle if Putin randomly decides that they aren't allowed internet for the day, Russia's small and medium-sized businesses are also pulling as much cash out of the banking system. Russia's central bank has identified this trend. It says that these businesses are trying to adapt to new tax rules introduced in 2026 to enable the Kremlin to fleece more money out of companies that are already struggling due to what Putin has done to the Russian economy. If this trend continues, the central bank says, many of Russia's smaller businesses will end up operating within the shadow economy. What this means is that an increasing number of businesses will start skirting around Russia's taxation system, instead operating unofficially and taking cash only, so that they don't have to pay the ridiculous levels of tax that Putin is demanding to keep his Ukraine invasion running. There are clear reasons why so many smaller businesses would choose to do something like this outside of the taxation issue. Higher taxes are being compounded by weak consumer demand, higher prices, and the first economic contraction that Russia has seen since 2023, the Moscow Times reported on May 15th. The impact of this lethal cocktail has been the closure of 209,000 small and medium businesses in Russia during the first quarter of 2026, which is a year-on-year increase of 9%. Retail, food services, and beauty salons are among the hardest hit of Russia's small and medium businesses, the outlet claims. These are all businesses that can operate on cash payments. We wonder how many of these closed businesses have instead just shifted into Russia's shadow economy. Based on an IntelliNews report from March, we're willing to bet that a few collapsed businesses might have made the shift. The outlet says the shadow economy in the beauty sector has expanded by 65.9%. In vehicle repair, Russia has seen an expansion of 69.5%, and there has been a growth of shadow economy activity to the tune of 58.6% in Russia's hotel sector. For Putin, whose success in the Ukraine invasion is everything, the fact that so many businesses are leaving the official Russian economy is a nightmare. Every shadow economy enterprise is a business that isn't paying the tax the Kremlin demands, which is likely stripping millions, if not billions of dollars out of Putin's war chest. But what can Russia's leader really expect? He hasn't helped his case by doing things like increasing Russia's value-added tax from 20% to 22%. Plus, the internet outages that the Kremlin so regularly enforces aren't doing much to create a stable business environment for companies that might not have considered going cash-only before. Discontent is already bubbling up as Russia restricts the use of apps like Telegram and WhatsApp. When you add outages into the mix, such as the months-long partial internet shutdowns that afflicted Moscow during the first quarter of 2026, you get the complete collapse of trust in the Russian financial system. And that's what all of this comes down to: trust. Russia's people and businesses no longer trust the banks, which is why they're pulling money out at record rates. And companies certainly don't seem to trust the Kremlin to act in their best interests, as they're being forced to shoulder the financial burden of the war that Putin started. The Kremlin isn't happy, neither are the banks, and both are combining in a desperate effort to stop Russia's people and businesses from doing what they're doing. But before we dig deeper into that, this is The Military Show, and we bring you the full picture, not just the headlines. Subscribe to stay ahead of the curve on every development in the Ukraine war and Russia's faltering society. So, Russia's central bank. It's trying to stop the mass withdrawals of cash in any way that it can. According to Euromaidan Press, June 1st saw the central bank implement new controls on ATM withdrawals in a desperate attempt to control what the Russian people do with their own money. These new rules empower Russia's banks to track every single customer's cash withdrawals. Any withdrawal that is marked as suspicious, which apparently accounts for multiple withdrawals in a short time span, or large withdrawals following long periods of inactivity, could lead to accounts being blocked or suspended pending a review. That's super smart, central bank. You have a crisis of trust tearing through the entire Russian banking industry as people worry about losing access to their money, and your solution is to threaten them with losing access to their money. It's almost as though the banks are trying to cripple themselves in their desperation to control what their customers are doing. What we see here is a clear prioritization of the stability of the banking system over the needs and wants of Russian consumers and businesses. This can't possibly end well. The dissent and distrust that have resulted in record-breaking withdrawals throughout 2026 are only going to grow as the central bank makes it clear that they control people's money more than the people themselves. As for the Kremlin, it's looking to exert control in a far more insidious way. Russian businesses increasingly being tempted toward the shadow economy shouldn't be a surprise, given the conditions that Putin has created for any company that doesn't serve the Russian war machine. But the Kremlin's response to a crisis that is causing it to generate fewer tax dollars than it believes it should be getting has caught everybody off guard. The Kremlin is going after people's pensions. It's going to cannibalize the old and those who are preparing for their futures to feed Putin's insatiable appetite for cash to fuel his Ukraine invasion. In a June 8th report, United 24 Media dropped the bombshell. The Russian government has started drafting legislation that will automatically transfer the pension savings of millions of Russians into a new program. Of course, this program is run by the state, which means that working Russians will have no choice about how the money they're saving for their future is invested. And this is far from a small program. If the Kremlin gets its way, 37 million Russians who the government classifies as silent investors will see their money get moved. Specifically, those who haven't chosen a private pension fund already and whose assets are currently in the social fund of Russia are going to see their right to choose taken away from them. Why would Russia's government want to do this? When you realize that about $41.1 billion is currently being managed by the state-owned Venetia Common Bank, or VEB, you start to get an idea. Of course, all of this is being dressed up as a good thing by Igor Shuvalov, who is the head of VEB and sees no reason why the establishment of a new state-controlled fund that allows the Kremlin's tendrils to run deeper into pension savings than ever before should be a problem. The VEB group will gain access to additional financial resources to operate, including citizens' long-term savings and pension funds, and will be able to invest these assets into modern technological projects, the Moscow Times reports the VEB head as claiming. How very vague. We wonder what modern technological projects means. We're sure it's not just code for the Russian defense industry. After all, there are plenty of modern tech projects happening in a country that the World Intellectual Property Organization says ranks 73rd for innovation inputs and 55th for innovation outputs in the world. Sarcasm aside, Russia's finance minister Anton Siluanov has already expressed his support for the bill, which basically translates to Putin saying that he wants this to happen. Siluanov claims that freeing up funds held in Russia's social fund could serve as a foundation for long-term savings. That could translate to billions being poured into a domestic stock market that has crumbled after it lost access to foreign investors following Putin's invasion. That won't inspire confidence. Pension pots are going to be used to prop up a stock market that fell to its lowest level since October on June 9th. This is a market that seems to ebb and flow based on the possibility of peace being declared with Ukraine. Whenever Putin says no to peace, which is literally every time the subject comes up, the Russian stock market nosedives. Not exactly the most secure investment vehicle for the pensions of 37 million people. We would also be remiss if we didn't mention that Russia spent $146.4 billion of its entire budget, accounting for 39% of all government spending, on its military during the first 9 months of 2025. That's 4 times the expenditure seen in 2021, and it was accompanied by a decline in social spending that has brought Russia's expenditure on its own people down to the lowest level seen in 20 years, United 24 Media reports. So 3 guesses which industries VEB will support with its new plan to use Russian pensions to buy stocks in. You'll be kidding, you don't need 3 guesses. Russia is once again trying to control people's money to prop up a war that has already cost untold billions of dollars, and will cost much more, as Putin refuses to even consider the possibility that maybe, just maybe, the war that he started isn't going to end in an inevitable Russian victory. This is the cannibalization of the financial assets of Russian people and businesses to fund the war. As Putin hides in his bunker and enjoys his vast wealth, his government is tearing away arms and legs from the country's people. Peter is being robbed to pay Paul, and what we're now starting to see are some very interesting parallels between Russia today and the Soviet Union when it faced its economic collapse. Let's look at that collapse for a moment. 3 of the chief causes of the Soviet Union's economic collapse were political and social unrest, declining industrial output, and rising consumer shortages, per Investopedia. The unrest is pretty clear to see in 2026's Russia. Billions of dollars being withdrawn from Russian banks is a clear indicator that the population has lost any trust in the financial institutions that are supposed to hold the Russian economy together. Internet crackdowns and constant creeping control over people's money to fund an unpopular war are hardly signs of political stability either. In a June 9th report, The Conversation noted that the Russian pollster, the Levada Center, has revealed that 62% of the Russians it questioned want the Ukraine war to end. Financial measures being put in place to ensure that the war can continue are pretty much the opposite of what the Russian people want. So that's the political and social unrest bubbling under and coming closer to exploding. The other two issues are becoming clearer to see. On the industrial output front, practically every sector, beyond those that serve the military-industrial complex in Russia, is struggling. And even the defense and energy sectors aren't making revenue that is plugged back into Russia. The money they make funds Putin's war machine. Russia's expected gross domestic product, or GDP, growth in 2026 has already been downgraded from 1.3% to 0.4%, the Moscow Times reports, which essentially means a year of stagnation. IntelliNews adds that the seasonally adjusted S&P Global Russia Manufacturing Purchasing Managers Index, or PMI, was at 48.8 in May. That's an increase over the 48.1 seen in April, but any PMI score below 50 is a sign of manufacturing contraction, and Russia has been mostly below and sometimes at 50 since the beginning of 2025. So it's safe to say that industrial output is declining in Russia. As for consumer shortages, they're not biting down with full force just yet, but they're coming. In occupied Crimea, we're starting to see panic buying of fuel and groceries as Ukraine's strategy of crippling Russian logistics in the occupied rear is making it harder for Russia to keep the peninsula and its people stocked up with what they need. Inside Russia itself, food inflation is making it harder for everyday Russians who are struggling with their country's economy to afford the basics. The cost of potatoes has risen 167% between 2024 and 26. Milk is 59% more expensive and bread has gone up 45%. There may not be shortages in the shops yet, but insane inflation like this is contributing to shortages in Russian pantries as people can't afford to buy as much food. If the Soviet economic crisis gave Russia the recipe for its own downfall, Putin has his chef's hat on and is cooking up a repeat. The signs are all there. Russia isn't quite at the point of economic collapse just yet, but as more billions pour out of a vulnerable banking system and both the Kremlin and the central bank continue to ignore the people in favor of propping up the war, all of these issues will get worse. There's no trust. Cash is being hoarded. The crippling of Russia is afoot, and the cannibalization that has just begun is only going to make it all happen faster. Putin's short-term mindset is to blame here. For some reason, the Russian president seems to think that all of these problems will magically solve themselves if he can just achieve a victory in Ukraine. But Putin is wrong. Win or lose, what comes after the Ukraine war is worse for Russia, as a crumbling economy combines with the massive geopolitical consequences of what Putin has done. Do you want to find out more? Watch our video to see what the future has in store for Russia. And if you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to The Military Show to see more coverage of the inevitable internal collapse of Russia. And thank you as always for watching.